Infinity Ward released Call of Duty in 2003. Since then, there have been 13 mainline Call of Duty games. The series has evolved heavily, spanning nearly 15 years since it first went into development. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on Game Ranks, the evolution of Call of Duty. So as a quick disclaimer, there are a massive amount of Call of Duty games. There's not only the 14 mainline games, but there's numerous offshoots as well, and for that reason we're going to stick to the main line, and in some cases even talk in simply general terms. There's a lot to keep track of, and it just makes sense to try and focus on the gameplay. In 2002, several developers who worked on Medal of Honor Allied Assault for EA Games formed a new company called Infinity Ward. They immediately set out to make Call of Duty, a World War II era first-person shooter that was built in the ID Tech 3 engine. What they really wanted to emphasize was squad-based play, because war is actually more like that. The first few decades of first-person shooters were very individualistic affairs. You were often a all-time hero type who was the best shooter, the strongest man, and the Call of Duty developers wanted to do something that was slightly more like real life. In order to accommodate this, they developed a custom artificial intelligence component that they called Conduit, which was meant to make pathfinding significantly more robust. Combined with a skeletal animation component that they developed to work with the ID Tech 3 engine, allowing for more area-specific things such as damage, cover, etc. A lot of ideas were integrated into squad combat on a single-player level that just wasn't there before. The AI did a fantastic job of moving non-player characters between cover points, engage in squad flanking, and other very team-based military maneuvers that were, real. And it worked very well, at least relative to how artificial intelligence was at the time. A lot of things that would have been scripted in the game had it been developed in a different way were instead left to the AI, so that encounters would play out slightly different or entirely different sometimes every time you played them. That's not to say that the encounters of the game were procedurally generated, however, they did a great job making the game somewhat more dynamic than previous games. Next came Call of Duty 2 in 2005, which took a different approach to the campaign. It had 4 different campaigns which you could drop in and out of, experiencing the story of 4 different characters, or you could simply play historic battles in chronological order, which actually kind of played like old school video game levels. It used a new version of the same engine, which had branched far enough from being ID Tech 3 that they were calling it the proprietary Infinity Ward Engine 2.0. Weather effects became a high priority, and they were able to add things like blizzards, which came off incredibly realistically, especially for the time, and generally upped the realism of sandstorms and smoke grenades. Some modifications to the engine allowed them to expand the scope of the battlefield, allowing for a less linear experience in which you would have to make more choices as to the route you would take, as opposed to simply having a level presented to you that you had to fight your way through. Speaking of the presentation, they added a feature called Battle Chatter, which had been in a previous Medal of Honor game. Battle Chatter was a way of making situational awareness. NPCs had conversations that regarded what was going on in the game at the time, and it did a good job of simulating a sort of what's going on here conversation. Call of Duty 2 actually stirred up a little bit of controversy in that they created a regenerating health system. What you know as probably the standard for everything now was implemented in a few different games of the era to differing degrees, including this one, Halo, etc., and that did itself have quite an influence on future games. Some complained that it made the sort of gritty realism of the first game sort of melt away. You became kind of a super soldier, a somewhat invincible, unstoppable force. All in all, though, the game was pretty well received. Call of Duty 3 came the next year, 2006, and it was developed in only 8 months by Treyarch. Treyarch had made a side story / expansion to the original Call of Duty 2 called Call of Duty 2 Big Red One, and Activision regarded it as a pretty good game, so they were given the responsibility of making the next Call of Duty. It ran on a different engine, Treyarch's internal engine. The game is honestly a lot like Call of Duty 2. There's 4 different campaigns of different countries, different soldiers from different places. It was really the scope that set the game apart. There's a lot more cinematic sort of quote-unquote wow moments in Call of Duty 3, and the battlefield always feels quite alive. There's lots of NPCs all fighting with each other pretty much at all times, and it sort of makes the feel of the game itself into more of an experience. Call of Duty 3 is also the first game in the series to have a branching mission structure. playing the game with slightly different tactics can actually change the result or objectives that you're dealing with. The game has phenomenal graphics for its time. It has good lighting, great effects, and far more detailed environments. More interesting, there was actually destructible cover in this game as well. Call of Duty 3's multiplayer was the first on consoles to support 16 players. Generally, I regard the multiplayer of Call of Duty 3 to be the sort of start point for the quote-unquote good multiplayer. It's worth talking about the multiplayer, in my opinion, in Call of Duty 3 because it's pretty much the baseline for the multiplayer in every following Call of Duty game up until this day. This is what I would call the last of the plain series, the vanilla series. Call of Duty now branches out, and it is a result of 2007's Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Now, aside from Treyarch being obviously very competent and creating a fantastic Call of Duty 3, there was another reason why Infinity Ward didn't develop Call of Duty 3. It's that they came up with a concept that they wanted to run with, Modern Warfare. Obviously, one of the big updates was, of course, equipment, which was all modernized, but there were a number of features that were introduced that had just not been there before. Where some things may have felt odd to do in the previous games, now you could do things like a heads-up display that had a little bit more interaction to it, telling you where to go for the next objective, and because technology could actually do that kind of a thing, digital displays and all that, it didn't seem so bizarrely out of place. Multiplayer builds on the previous multiplayer, adding the ability to earn experience points, which unlock new weapons and modes, and also created the kill streak. There is no specific protagonist of the campaign, but it's not separated into different campaigns. There's one specific story, and you experience the whole thing. The following year, Call of Duty World at War came out, which is another World War II game. Treyarch developed this game, but it does use the same engine as the Modern Warfare series. It retains a lot of the features that were created for Modern Warfare, however, it obviously goes back to the World War setting. It also, for the first time, included co-op. If you were on console, you could play 2-player via split screen and handle the game that way, or if you wanted to, go online and play 4-player co-op. It's also the first Call of Duty to feature a zombies game. Nazi Zombies is a game where 1 to 4 players can fight an unlimited number of waves of, you guessed it, Nazi zombies. You gain points by killing zombies, and as you get those points, you get better weapons, windows that were boarded up and they got through get repaired, and although you might consider this stuff fairly standard nowadays, this is a pretty new and interesting idea for a Call of Duty game to do and was a lot of fun. In 2009, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 came out. The proprietary Infinity Ward 4.0 game engine was touted as a generation beyond capabilities of what was previously used in World of War and Call of Duty 4. Aside from substantial visual improvements, the thing they wanted to address the most was the AI. They wanted enemies to be smarter, and developed a system which, instead of infinitely respawning enemies at random points in a level, they have smarter enemies that actively seek out the player. They can deviate from behaviors, have their own pathfinding, and essentially end up acting at least slightly differently every single time you play the level, and that's a good thing because that dynamic feel is something that heightens the immersion of the world around you. The less it feels like a sort of list of events that are meant to happen, the more it feels like a battlefield. Modern Warfare followed a lot of the aesthetic ideas of a film. It had more defined characters, a much more obvious plot, and a lot more set pieces. In fact, while these do help thrill the player, there's no denying that a common criticism for this was that it was relying too heavily on that. Now, it wasn't a criticism that stopped it from getting the highest scores on Metacritic that a Call of Duty game had ever gotten. It really is a damn good game. But it's also a game that I would call a lot more evolutionary than revolutionary, which makes sense. This is the evolution of Call of Duty, obviously. However, let's be completely honest. This is kind of the point where these games started becoming much more incremental in changes and more an engine to deliver content. Call of Duty Black Ops takes place during the 1960s, which is a new setting for Call of Duty. However, it didn't play particularly differently and was a really high quality game that ran on a enhanced version of the World at War engine. Treyarch developed this game and for the first time in quite a while was the only game they were developing at the time of its development. They focused exclusively on Black Ops and created a story that was not only compelling, but established a totally different setting that actually worked really well in a Call of Duty game. 2011's Modern Warfare 3 served as an escalation of the events from Modern Warfare 2. The campaign was divided up into 3 acts, and the multiplayer was sort of oriented more around points rather than specifically kills. Kill streaks were changed over to point streaks. Anytime you completed an objective, like capturing the flag in that mode, you would get points. When you accumulated enough points, you'd get a reward. And other than those changes, isn't a major different game from the previous Modern Warfare. It focused more on content, on story, on narrative, and just improvements in the multiplayer, which in all actuality isn't necessarily a bad thing. Call of Duty Black Ops 2 came in 2012, and it's the first Call of Duty game to have branching storylines in it. The choices a character makes during a mission end up affecting the overall world. They change the story and can even result in permadeath. This game is actually set in the future in 2025, which, considering it's a sequel to a game that took place in the Vietnam era, is interesting. However, in that it's set in a hypothetical futuristic setting, it's able to have a lot of technology in it that just doesn't exist. This was a first, and at the time it was very, very cool. In fact, it's still very, very cool. Bearing in mind the plot actually starts in 1986 and ends up in 2025, it's actually a pretty ambitious project. The gameplay itself has to evolve quite a bit over the time, going from a 1986 Cold War setting to 2025 in a hypothetical second Cold War. There's also a zombies campaign, which is just, well, it's silly. It's fun, but it's definitely silly. Call of Duty Ghosts happened in 2013 and really didn't evolve any at all. There really wasn't any. It was just a game that was kind of Modern Warfare-ish. And then 2014 saw Call of Duty Advanced Warfare. Now, this was the first game headed by Sledgehammer Games, which had co-developed Modern Warfare 3. The campaign features one specific character as opposed to multiple characters in every single other Call of Duty game, and featured a number of fairly significant improvements. For instance, the facial animation system. Being Kevin Spacey was the bad guy and they wanted the bad guy to actually look like Kevin Spacey, they did facial capture for Kevin Spacey. The system that they used to implement it is actually the same system used to implement facial animation in Avatar 2, which will eventually come out at some point most likely. The engine itself was mostly rewritten. Sledgehammer said they pretty much built the engine from scratch. There is some stuff from the previous engine, but they needed to make a game that looked like a new game. Now, this would be the second new generation, that is to say Xbox One and PS4 compatible Call of Duty game, and it was a fantastic looking game, it really was. Between extra bad Frank Underwood and not having a traditional HUD, instead projecting things holographically from the weapons that are currently equipped, there were graphical touches to this game that I don't think really had been present in Call of Duty. The gameplay also evolved in one key way: the exosuit capabilities. A boost, a dash, and a sky jump pretty much made things really different, although beyond that, there really isn't a lot of major changes in the gameplay. Just adding those things into it almost makes it a completely different game though, and branched the gameplay off into an area that some people really love and some people, well, kind of lament in a way. Call of Duty Advanced Warfare had a 3-year development cycle, and it showed. It was a polished product that really came out strong. And whether or not you like the technological warfare ideas presented in the game, or the type of gameplay they inevitably create, it really was a high-quality Call of Duty game, the kind that, frankly, they should always be. The next year, Call of Duty Black Ops 3 came out. It also had a 3-year development cycle, and it also showed. The game doesn't do anything significant to evolve beyond the previous title. However, it is by far the Call of Duty game with the most content. By being basically Advanced Warfare Plus and keeping people busy as long as they wanted to, it got a pretty good reputation. It sold better than Advanced Warfare and Ghosts, and although a lot of critics did say this really doesn't do anything to meaningfully develop the series, it's a really solid game with a lot of content. In 2016, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare came out. This would be the third game in a row that was basically the same game. Although it moved the game's setting to space, most of the gameplay was pretty much the same. However, for a series that jumps around in setting, doing a modern game here, a Vietnam game there, a World War II game every once in a while, doing 3 games in a row of this, well, at this point, very similar gameplay that doesn't continue to develop very much, got people pretty mad. and although it wasn't reviewed badly, it averaged in the high 70s, people had gotten kinda sick of it, and I don't blame people for that. If you're gonna just release the same thing 3 years in a row, and each of these games had a 3-year development cycle, at some point could someone have said, well, we should maybe mix it up a little bit on the third one? And then Battlefield 1 came out and kind of compounded everybody's feelings on that by being a very good game that was set in a very real-world setting. It was gritty, down to earth, and in a lot of ways quite weighty. So when they announced Call of Duty World War II, it was looked at with a bit of a sigh of relief. A lot of people are very excited for it and view it as a very positive thing. Over the years, Call of Duty has morphed wildly and then sort of stagnated for a while, so they have an opportunity to really get back to their roots and do something innovative. But the real question is exactly what would that be? We are talking a game that is set in a real-world setting where certain things actually happen, and going too far off the rails would verge into historical inaccuracy. This isn't Wolfenstein, obviously. Nevertheless, a lot of people are very hopeful, and I think that it's with good reason. Them doing a World War II game is kind of an acknowledgement of what people actually want, so let's hope it turns out very good. What's your favorite Call of Duty, and what do you think of Call of Duty World War II? Leave us a comment. Also do us a big favor and click like. If you're not subscribed, now would be a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every single day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on GameRanks.